All right, looks like we can get started. Cool. Well, hey everybody, welcome to RoastID's third and final rounds webinar. We're very glad to have you here. Very excited to be getting to the results of the competition. So we'll be getting to that at the very end. But yeah, we'll start with some quick introductions. My name is Taylor Wallace. I'm an account manager at Cropster. A little bit about Cropster. If you're not familiar, we provide software for the entire coffee specialty supply chain, all the way from origin at the farm all the way to the cafe. So, of course, what we're going over now is the roasting side of things, and all the screenshots you'll be seeing in the competition are screen grabs from our software. So if you're ever curious, feel free to reach out to me.
Yep. And then howdy, everyone. My name is Eric Stanek, and I am coming to you from Charleston, South Carolina. I work with the green coffee importer, Balzac Brothers. Been around for quite a while, founded in 1917. And kind of our focus is to bring in coffees that are of high quality and also sustainably sourced. And really, we try to be a very service-oriented importer. So check us out if you haven't. Really excited to have everyone here and to be able to work with Cropster on this really fun competition. So,
but what's way more important than both Eric and me,
much more important than either of us.
Yes. I'm very excited to have Joe with us today. He's shaking his head because he's the kind and humble guy that he is.
Modest human.
Today he's coming to us from List and Weissler. He is doing coffee sales and education for them. We're very excited to have him here.
Yep.
Between, I think if you type in the words Joe Marrocco coffee roasting on YouTube, I think between his videos with Cafe Imports and Mill City Roasters that he did in the past, he has tens of thousands of views, probably even hundreds of thousands of views. And so a lot of
views.
A lot of people have received a lot of good instruction from Joe over the years, and that's why we're very excited to have him here with us today, talking with us. And little plug for him as well. He's also going to be starting a new coffee podcast called Get Coffee, coming next month. Is that right, Joe?
Yep, that's right. Cool. I'm very excited about that too. Yeah, and also I just want to give a quick shout out to Andrew Timko, who is the roaster and one of the founders of Blueprint Coffee. He taught me how to roast first, and he's in this chat or this meeting.
Oh, that's awesome.
Cool.
That's so cool.
Great. I like that.
All right.
Cool.
So yeah, before we get rolling, kind of chatting about this most recent round, I want to give y'all just a quick recap of rounds 1 and 2. We gave a recap of round 1 last week, but round 2 we're showing here, and really interesting to see that we actually had more people get all 5 correct in round 2, which was cool to see, because that means y'all were kind of getting the feel for the competition potentially, and just kind of understanding how it works, and you were doing well. So that was cool to see, and we still had a high number of responses. And then in total between the 2 rounds, we kind of just threw those stats on the bottom where you can see between the first two rounds how many people got how many answers correct. So you have quite a few people that fall right in that middle range between about 8 or 7, and then like 3 or 4, so right in the middle, which is cool. But you have a select individuals, actually 8 individuals, who got all 10 correct in the first 2 rounds. So small clap to those people. It's very impressive. So and we will chat at the end of this webinar about the round 3 results, and we will reveal the top 10. But for now, we're going to dive into round 3 and what we're going to be talking about today. So as many of you probably saw, this final round was a little bit different and a little bit tricky. Taylor and I chatted about this, and we kind of wanted to really amp it up a little bit and bring a new challenge to the round and talk about something that we think is really important in the coffee industry, which is blends. I mean, they're prevalent everywhere. And so we think it's important for us to touch upon them. And that's kind of the idea of why this round was the way it was, where you're matching what components went into blends. And so we'll talk more about the curves and the coffees themselves here soon. But just really briefly, the round 3 topics that we're going to be chatting about today are blends, of course, like what is the reason for them and what is to remember when creating blends or roasting for blends. The hotly debated topic of do you pre-roast or do you post-roast, which is something Taylor loves to ask everywhere he goes. Really divides people. And then we'll also dive into talking about kind of green coffee characteristics, specifically with the green coffees that we were using for this round, what to consider when roasting various coffee origins. So like, what are the differences between a coffee, say, from Indonesia versus a coffee from Brazil, or the general differences. Darker roasts, so what to consider when roasting darker or just developing coffees much past first crack and near or at second crack. Water content, why does it matter? And how do you adjust for water content? And then also processing method we wanted to include here. So we have a broad range of topics that we kind of wanted to touch on to kind of wrap up this competition. So hopefully you enjoy it. Please ask questions as we go through. Taylor will be working through the chat and including those as we go. So yeah, ask away. Don't feel shy. We enjoy questions. Joe loves questions. So we'll get started. Understanding round 3. As I had said, this round was a bit different. And so in the first 2 rounds, you were given this kind of roast compare curve where you had a baseline curve and then all 5 of the different or new curves compared against that baseline. But in this round, since each specific origin was one curve versus the baseline, this roast compare image at the beginning wasn't probably as useful. So this may not have helped so much. And so we want to kind of dive into how do you then understand what is going on in this round and get to the final answers. And so we kind of have this workflow that we're going to use in this webinar to do that. And really it starts from the core of what you're roasting, which is important at your roastery or when you're talking with roasters as well, is understanding the green coffee quality. So what are you starting with? What is your raw product? Examine the quality of that coffee itself. Brainstorm what are the possible flavors of those coffees, and then establish those typical flavor profiles you should expect. And so we're going to do that for those 5 coffees and kind of talk about what the typical flavor profiles we expected these coffees to have and we used to create these blends. And then once we move from the green coffee quality, we're going to talk about the influence of the roast curves on each one of those specific origins. So that's going to kind of be the same as the first 2 rounds where we're looking at a baseline and then the new curve, and then what was influenced in that roasting process and how that influences quality. And then we're going to relate that back to the typical flavor profiles that we established for the green coffee that we're using. And then lastly, the most important part, because this will give you the answers, how do these actually come together to create the blends that we put on this in this round 3? So we are going to use those flavor notes of those green coffees, how the curves influence those flavor notes and the qualities of the coffee itself, and then kind of just walk through how those come together to create those scores, and then also how you can find out what proportions were what for the blends. So it's a lot, but we're gonna walk through it. Joe's gonna help us, Taylor's gonna help us, and we're gonna get it done. So first and foremost, the green coffees that we used. You got to know what you're working with. These were the 5 coffees that we used in this round. We kind of wanted to touch upon coffees that we had not used in the first 2 rounds, and then additionally just kind of spread it out for coffees grown across the world. And it's especially using profiles for coffees that seem to pop up pretty regularly in most roasteries or cafes. And so you have your African coffees, some Indonesians, and then also some South American coffees for Brazil and Colombia. And for these 5 coffees, as I had mentioned, each one of these coffees kind of has a typical flavor profile you can expect, and the industry kind of expects as well. And so we are going to chat about that, and I'm going to show you what were the typical profiles or expected profiles that we used to create the flavors, which then went into creating the blends. And this is kind of where I'm going to bring in Joe. So Joe, I would love if you can kind of just chat about each one of these 5 coffees and just kind of the typical flavor profiles, like an Ethiopian natural, kind of like a grade 2, like Ethiopian wash, Sumatra, Brazil, and Colombia, and then kind of the typical flavor profiles you can expect.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. And
awesome.
You know that there are probably people on this call who are from these places. And you may have a very different perspective on some of these coffees. But here in the United States, the grades that we have here have pretty standard, as Eric was saying, expectations and profiles. So we're just going to talk about what we get here and kind of our standard flavor expectations. So in Ethiopia, Yirgacheffe Grade 2 Natural is definitely going to have that berry forward characteristic that you would expect from maybe even a Grade 1, but it's dialed down a little bit. A lot of people will assume that the acidity in Ethiopian Natural is very high because they taste fruit. But actually, the acidity is a little bit more mild. The tingling sensation that you get in your mouth from like citric acid or other acids like that are actually a little bit lower, but you get a lot more aromatic fruit characteristic from it. That berry characteristic, all the way to winey. And sometimes you'll get a few more Quakers in a Grade 2. Quakers are those beans that look a little lighter after you've roasted it, and those can add a bready flavor or a nutty flavor. So some of those flavors are coming out. And roasted a little bit more, it kind of turns more chocolatey, like cacao. So moving on to the washed Grade 2, same thing. It's just a dialed down version of a Grade 1 washed. Grade 1s are known for being very floral, very bright, crisp, and clean. You'll get just a little bit more muddiness in a Grade 2. Not so much Quakers in the wash because they use flotation to get the Quakers away. You'll get more spicy notes, a little bit more earthiness, not quite the same level of acidity. And the price point is a lot lower, so a lot of people will use these for those characteristics, but in a blend kind of scenario. Sumatra Grade 1 is going to be a pretty clean Sumatra, but it's still going to have a lot of earthiness, a lot of herbal aromatics going on. Generally, they're known for being very heavy in body and a lot of spice. A lot of maybe tobacco herbaceousness in a Grade 1, but a bit more refined. And Gilles is referring to also what a lot of people will call wet hulled processing. So it's processed in a very Sumatra or Indonesian specific way. Moving on to Brazil, a pulp natural Brazil is going to be a little bit cleaner than a full natural Brazil. Minas Gerais is a nice high growing region in southern Brazil. So your cup is going to be soft. Strictly soft is referring to it not having a defect called Rio-y. So that soft characteristic is going to mean that it's going to have a nice velvety mouthfeel, probably a lot of milk chocolate. This is another coffee that is also going to be lower in acidity. I forgot to mention that for Sumatra. Sumatras are generally known for lower acidity, a bit heavier body. And a lot of people will use this in a blend because it's kind of like a blank canvas. It sets up all of the other characteristics and all of the other coffees to really pop forward. And it kind of just adds that nice, what I would call nostalgic coffee flavor to the background of your cup. And it's probably going to be the most affordable of all of these coffees to put in your blend, so it keeps that blend cost a little lower. Colombia, Excelso, usually these do have a little bit of a punch of citric acidity. They're also nice and mild and nutty. A little bit more refined than the Brazil, but also serving as a more affordable filler in a lot of blends. And Excelso is a 16 screen size and above generally. And so the screen size is nice, and so it can take on a little bit more heat. A Brazil in a blend for dark roasting may get a little ashy in flavor, whereas a little bit bigger washed Colombia can hold up under the heat a little bit more.
Yep. I mean, that's you nailed it, Joe. So everything that Joe was saying there, those expected flavor profiles and kind of how those change as you roast them were things that we considered as we created the cupping form for these blends. So this was kind of on you all to figure out and to kind of research or maybe understand previously. And so once you've established what are the expected or typical flavor profiles for these coffees. Then you can begin to look at the influence of the curves that were given, or breaking down the components. So if we refer to components throughout this webinar, what we're talking about is each one of those coffees, each one of those origins that went into a blend. That is a component. And so once again, coming back to this curve, we're going to break down each 5 of these coffees, or each 5 of these components, and just talk about how they were, how the quality of the coffee itself was influenced from the change in the curve versus the baseline or the typical normal roast profile that you would use in the roastery. So this is kind of the cupping score for the cupping score form for the components that we used. It looks like kind of like the other rounds. It kind of looks like the cupping form. This was not shown to you all. This was used by us in the background to generate these scores. So we went through and we created body, acidity, sweetness, color, and changes in flavor notes for each one of these component coffees, which then we use these to create the cupping scores for the blends. And so we're going to work through all 5 of these, starting with that Ethiopia natural. The cool thing is with each one of these curves, a lot of what's going on, you might be able to find, if you don't understand or don't quite get what we're talking about in this webinar, check the first 2 webinars, because a lot of these topics were discussed in the first 2, which is super cool. So just remember that, because that's a lot of topics here. And so starting with this Ethiopia natural, there's various things that are going on, from a lower start temperature all the way to a shorter overall time, and also a lower temperature, which has an influence on the quality of the coffee itself. And so, Joe, if you just want to, once again, just kind of break this down and why what's happening on this curve created these scores up at the top, would be awesome.
For sure. I'm going to briefly get into a little bit of theory about naturals.
Yes, and that's a question coffees. I have.
Okay, good. So if you think about coffee as a seed, which we all should think about coffee as a seed, the seed's job is to feed a new plant and to really harbor enough food storage for that new plant to use that energy up while it fixes itself in whatever environment it falls into. And so a seed that's growing at a very high altitude needs a whole lot of storage. If it's on a slope and it's not, the water's going to run away, it's not going to have as much sunlight, it's going to be colder, it's not going to have the warmth for all of its metabolism to happen. And so that's why higher grown coffees usually have more density, because there's more food packed into that seed to help that little plant get its good start. Well, once a plant is detached from the tree, once the seed is detached from the tree, its job is to sustain life and start life of that new plant. The theory is that a natural process coffee, since it's in a dark, moist place, which is inside of that cherry while it's drying slowly over time, that it's actually starting the process of germination. That starting of germination means that it already is beginning to break down the non-soluble material in that seed into soluble, usable energy. So it's almost like a natural coffee has got a little bit of a head start on the roasting process, because when we're roasting a coffee, what we're doing is taking that non-soluble stored material and we're breaking it down into usable energy, or flavor, as we call it. So you'll notice on the curve, generally speaking, any natural that we're roasting, if we're using cupping and tasting to kind of figure out where the best spot of that roast is, if we have 2 coffees that are from the identical plants, identical region, identical harvest, one of them is washed and one of them is natural, you'll find that your natural processed coffee is going to be fully roasted at an earlier drop temperature and a lower drop temperature than your washed equivalent. And I believe, and a lot of other people believe, that that's because of that initial germination that's happening in the seed. So that's one reason that naturally we go a lower charge temperature and a little bit of a lower end temperature. Also, you'll notice that generally speaking, when you have a lower end temperature, you're going to probably have a lower charge temperature at the same time. Those things are usually kind of corollary. If you think about it as cooking, if I want my cookies to bake at a certain time and temperature, then I'm not going to have like a 500-degree oven, because that's burn the outside and leave the inside too raw. So your end temperature and your starting temperature need to be kind of similar. So we noticed that on the curve. You also notice that at the end of this curve, it kind of tapers down. It gets softer in the application of heat. We're a little bit more gentle. A lot of natural processed coffees have some of that fruit material still left on the outside of the seed. If we get later in the roast and hit it with a lot of heat, you'll notice that the outside of that actually looks burnt, even at a lighter roast. That fruit material burns very easily. The chaff line becomes black very easily. That's not to say to avoid that, because you actually can't. But you can kind of dial it back and add a little softer application of heat, so that even though it may look black, it doesn't taste black in the cup.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, and as Joe pointed out, the end temp here, especially versus the baseline, is a little bit shorter. The temperature, the time, and the temperature itself is a little bit lower. And so, because of those two things, you can kind of see on the cupping form we have here, we assumed this Ethiopia natural, this new curve, to kind of have a lower body, because it's a shorter roast, and you see the yellowing time, or the Maillard phase down there at the bottom, is a little bit shorter, and then also a much higher acidity. And now, once again, as Joe said, this acidity isn't necessarily the acidity that you would find in an Ethiopia washed, but it's still going to have a higher acidity because you have a shorter development time at the end and a lower end temperature. So you're burning away or using up less of those acids. And then additionally, you have a higher sweetness as well because of that shorter roast time. So there's the presence of the sugar still more. And then additionally, a lower color score. And so, yeah, and then the flavor notes themselves kind of transform from that berry, winey, bready cacao to something that is a little more underdeveloped, to switching over to a bright, kind of a sweet, funky, maybe you're getting some of that sweet bread from those Quakers that are there, those are shining through a little bit more. So, yeah. Joe, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say that with a little bit more roasting, you can roast out any kind of defect or negative flavor in a coffee and kind of smooth the coffee out. So as you dial it back, if there are defects, which a grade 2 is going to have some of those Quakers, like Eric was saying, that's why those Quakers will begin to really stand out. That's why simple roasting is done at such a light, fast roast, is because we can taste defects at that light, fast roast.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is the Ethiopian natural coffee and kind of how we saw it as changing based on the roast curve. And we will move on to the next coffee, which is the Ethiopia washed. And so Ethiopia washed has a little bit of funkiness going on, maybe something that y'all saw in the very first round, where once it gets to the end of the roast, there is something that went wrong right around first crack. Temperature dropped off. The rate of rise dropped off. So maybe heat application stalled, not enough heat was added, or something happened where that rate of rise just really, it stopped. It hit zero, which is going to have an effect of baking. So yeah, Joe, if you just want to talk briefly about this curve versus the baseline in the background and how that's going to influence the quality, and then also just Ethiopia washed versus a natural would be awesome.
Yeah, so the washed coffee in general is going to be a harder bean. It's going to take on energy a little bit better. It's going to be able to roast a little bit longer at a higher drop temperature and hit its, what I would call, peak performance as a coffee. You notice that right around here, there starts to be a little bit of a division. The original curve is down here and the new curve is up above. So that means it's taking on energy a little bit faster. So usually what people will do whenever they see that is they all of a sudden they cut off their gas, or they drop their gas, and then you can see how that results in the coffee just losing a ton of energy through this part of the phase. Well, instead of cutting this gas to maybe zero, maybe they should have just cut it a little, because it looks like they kicked the legs out from underneath this coffee.
Yeah.
So here is where it begins to flatten. And that flattening means that the reactions that are happening that cause flavor to build in a coffee kind of stop. And the coffee just kind of stalls in building new flavor, whereas the flavor that has been built already also begins to kind of cook away. And that's where we get that, what we call baked coffee. Now, I think about baked in a little bit of a different way than maybe some other instructors out there think about it. I think about it in terms of if your coffee had the potential for, let's say, your acidity to be a 10 out of 10, your sweetness to be 10 out of 10, your body to be a 10 out of 10, it dials those down. So it doesn't necessarily create a new flavor. Like we think a lot of people associate a flavor with baking. It's actually, you just kind of dial down the volume of the potential flavors that were already there and were already made. Now, if you start baking a coffee at the point where it has not developed positive flavors, a baked coffee may actually taste kind of grassy because you're holding on to those flavors that were pre-first crack and you're not cooking them out any further. So in a like this, where we're post-first crack, we went through first crack at a pretty good clip, and then we stall it. It probably is holding on to some of that negative grassy characteristic a little bit, but then those nice, rich, bright acids that kind of come out of going through first crack have been let go. And so they're lost to us now. And we didn't really get into developing the sweetness anymore. And so this coffee is going to be pretty flat and kind of boring. And since it's gray too, and it was already not, the brightest crayon in the coloring box, it's going to be losing those components. And really, we're using this Ethiopia most likely for that acidity.
Yeah.
Since in a blend, we're looking to highlight acidity by using this coffee, and we strip the acidity away by baking the end of the roast, by letting it just kind of coast. We're not going to find what we were hoping for.
Yeah, which is why, as you said, Joe, kind of turning down that volume, you see all the scores here, they're decreased. The body, the sweetness, the acidity, it's lesser. And as you had mentioned, like you would typically use that Ethiopia washed in a blend to give it that pop, that acidity. And so if you're turning all of that down, you're going to see a pretty noticeable effect in a blend, which we'll see later on. So, yeah. So then moving on to the next curve, we get into our Indonesian coffee from Sumatra. And this one varies from the other two in that it's roasted to a much higher temperature. At least a lot of folks will use these kind of Sumatras for kind of the added like body, earthiness, heaviness to blends. And so kind of that's the idea we had here. And the curve, the new curve versus the baseline, you'll see actually goes a little bit farther in development. So we have a little bit higher of a end temperature, and then we also have a little bit longer of a time. So we're taking an already more developed coffee and making it even more developed, which is what you're going to see occur in these scores up top. So yeah, Joe, do you want to talk about Sumatra's fascinating coffee? Fascinating coffee.
Yes, I actually love Sumatran coffees. It is maybe not a very popular thing amongst a lot of third wavers here in the U.S., but I love their funkiness. I love how they're just so diversified from a lot of other coffees. I like things that taste different. Maybe that's not necessarily good. I don't know. But I also love how Sumatra's balance in a blend. I think that they add a lot of base note, a lot of body, a lot of vanilla, and some other characteristics that cupped on their own you don't really get necessarily. Now, since the Sumatra adds body, it looks like on the roast that we have in front of us, this period between yellow and first crack is really where a lot of body is developed. That is what we generally refer to as the Maillard phase. And during the Maillard phase, where you're breaking down sugars and proteins and you're getting new compounds, those are called melanoidins. melanoidins are what actually make it brown. It's like the melanin in our skin that make skin brown. Those things are actually, they add texture to coffee. They have been credited with the body that you feel in coffee. And so if you drag through that stage, you may actually draw your acidity down, but you trade that in for a heavier body. So it looks like on this, that variance in drawing this down is why we get this increase in body and texture over here.
Yep.
Then up here, where we're a little bit darker, we are going to get a little bit of a darker note, but a Sumatra can handle going longer and darker without tasting ashy.
Yeah.
I think that there are a lot of reasons for that, but a darker roast on a Sumatra generally is a more preferred roast because those under roasted notes in a Sumatra can taste really green, like super green, pea soup, and like raw tobacco. And we like those flavors to be drawn out a little bit more.
Yeah, you're spot on, Joe. And that's kind of, honestly, you touched on most all the things here that occur in the differences from the baseline. So yeah, spot on. So we're gonna jump in really quick. Taylor, do we have any questions about these first three curves before we just keep rolling on?
We're looking good in the chat.
Sounds good. Cool. And we'll hop on to the next coffee, the Brazilian. And so very similar in a sense of the end temp as the Sumatra. This Brazilian was pushed a little bit farther than the two Ethiopians were. And the other things to note on this curve is you also have a higher start temperature at the beginning here. And it kind of rides above the curve the entire time and finishes at a higher temperature, but a shorter time, which are going to have some unique influences on the quality of the coffee. And so, Joe, you already chatted briefly about Brazils and kind of their use, but if you want to touch upon that again, and just like in roasting these Brazils for blends, especially this one in particular, and then how that curve itself versus the baseline influences the quality.
Yeah, Brazils are also going to be a softer coffee, and so if you get a lot of heat, you know, that can burn those Brazils out a little bit more. And you notice here also we have this body score at a -1. The acidity is at a -1 off the baseline. That's really due to, you know, this section right here where you're rushing through the roast. You're not going to spend the time to develop those melanoidins. And acidity actually has to be cooked into the coffee. If you taste green coffee is not acidic. You actually have to break down molecules to get acidity into the coffee. And so since we rush through this phase, and then we also rush through the development phase, and we finish at a higher temperature, so whatever acidity was there kind of got burned out as it was getting developed. Our acidity is dropping in an already low acidic coffee. Our body is dropping, which is something we want from the Brazil. But we might hold on to some of that sweetness because the acidity is going to be lower. And so some of your sweetness may pop through a little.
Yep. And so that's, that was the reason, as we chatted for previously, Joe, for everyone, that's the idea is like that. Yeah, that acidity dropped off and that sweetness is going to be a little more prevalent because of that shorter time. So not really burning it off. It shines through a little bit more. And then also that kind of correlates to a lot of the flavor notes that are showing here. But really, these roasts aren't too drastically different. One is just pushed a little more and a little shorter. The new one is. So and so then moving on to the final coffee, the fifth coffee that we used was the Colombia. And the Colombia, what occurred with the Colombia was pretty similar to the Ethiopia natural, where you're seeing in this one, very slightly lower end temperature, and then also a shorter time overall for this roast, which is, if you look at the modulation chart at the bottom, you're getting a little bit of a lower yellowing time or Maillard phase, and then also pretty noticeable by 16 seconds actually of a development phase that is less. So that is going to itself have some influence on kind of the scores itself by just kind of shortening up that curve and taking a little bit lighter. And so Colombians, Joe, talk about Colombian coffees.
I love Colombian coffees. One of my favorite regions.
I'm a big fan as well.
I would say that this is a pretty standard Colombian coffee roast, just finished a little bit early. I know that it looks like the variance here is kind of big, but this isn't actually a big variance. A lot of research shows that, like for instance, if you have a yellow happening at the exact same temperature, but just a little later in time, that you can't taste the difference between those really. That flavor starts to develop at the point of yellowing. And so if my curve at the point of yellowing to the point of first crack to the point of my end of my roast is completely parallel, that those curves are going to taste almost identical. The main difference here is that we went longer and at a different drop temperature for the end of the roast. This is where I would pay the most attention here. And so due to the variance there being a little bit lighter, a little bit shorter, we're going to have a little bit more acidity. We're going to have a little bit more sweetness coming through this coffee because there is going to be some variance here that I think will add a little bit of sweetness. And the color is going to be a little less, just barely though. So, I mean, really, we're rounding up fractions on this one in my opinion. They're going to be very similar.
Yep, exactly. And then, though this Colombian itself, I would have to go back to the slide to check what it was. The water content I want to bring up, which I wanted to chat about, this one is pretty good, but I wanted to bring it up because we do have in Indonesia, Sumatra coffee with a higher water content here, and then also the Brazil was listed as a little bit lower water content. And so I'm curious, Joe, if you could chat just briefly about how that influences the mindset going into a roast, where if you have a coffee at 12.5% versus a coffee that's 10.5% water content, like what do I have to do? What am I going to change? Why does that matter?
So there are a lot of opinions about water content, and I would say there's a lot of differing and counterpuntal opinions about this.
Great word.
And I would my perspective on this is this. So if you think about coffee, so think about having a vial of coffee seeds, okay? And in that vial, you have 100 beans, and that vial equals 100 grams. And you say it's 10% moisture. Well, that means that for every 100 grams, 10 grams in that vial is going to be moisture, okay? Every seed is then going to be like 0.1% moisture. Well, if I have another vial that is filled to 100 grams and I say, okay, this coffee is 10% moisture, but it's a more dense coffee. So instead of there being 100 beans in that vial, there's actually 80 beans in that vial because it's more dense. And it's still 10% moisture. Well, every bean is not going to have 10% moisture in the bean. It's 10% moisture in the mass. Every bean individually is actually going to be higher in moisture because we're looking at density and moisture. And you have to remember that moisture is a percentage that we get off of a certain amount of coffee that we have either measured by volume or measured by weight. And that percentage matters. There are two parts to a percentage. So you have to ask, like 10% of the mass overall is going to be very different than 10% of each individual bean. And so it could be the case that you might have a very dry bean that measures at 10% moisture or a very moist bean that measures at 10% moisture, depending on the overall density. And so then whenever you go to roast that coffee, if you have a really dense coffee and you are weighing out, let's say you have a 20-pound roaster or a 20-kilo roaster. I'll go kilos since we're global today. Your 20-kilo roaster is going to be more filled with a lower density coffee, and your 20-kilo roaster is going to be less filled with a lower density coffee. So if you have, or with a higher density coffee, sorry. So if you have a really high density coffee, you actually have far fewer beans in your drum. And so I think a lot of the talk around moisture is actually missing the bigger picture of density. and how we should go about changing things for density, because you're actually changing the amount of physical material that you have in your drum and how heat is going to exchange through that physical material. So I recommend getting a moisture density meter that reads both moisture and density. You're looking at moisture. Moisture has been looked at for a long time by importers, exporters, millers, because the moisture content in a coffee overall kind of has a lot to do with how it's going to age over time. A really high moist coffee is going to be a lot more volatile, and a super low moisture coffee means that the coffee is probably already dead. Coffee is actually a living seed, and it's ready for germination. So having that range of 9.5 to 12.5% means that it's a viable seed, and so it's going to taste good. But that doesn't mean that a 9.5 coffee, it doesn't mean that sorry guys, it doesn't mean that a 9.5% moisture coffee is actually low in moisture. It could be that it's super dense, and so it's just measuring low in moisture, but each seed within that measurement actually may have more. I'm sorry to be confusing, but that's reality.
That's wonderful, because that's asked by a lot of people all the time, and I think it's especially important that people consider both. I'm learning things here. This is awesome. So those are great points. Those are things for everyone here to consider. Is pay attention, not just moisture but also density is extremely important for those reasons, and probably more as well. So this is our final curve for our fifth coffee, and kind of just rounding it out, here's the full cupping form for all 5 of those coffees that we use to create the scores for the blends. And so next, now that you have established the typical flavor profiles of those green coffees, and then you kind of worked through all of those roasts and identified how does that new curve change the quality of the coffee, you can then begin to look at the cupping form for the blends, which has those scores listed and has those blend flavor notes. And so it's a lot to bring together, but that's kind of the process that that at least we recommended, or at least we thought through it when creating these. And so we're going to dive into each one of these blends and just kind of explain what went into them and how that influenced the flavor. So starting with the first blend, a little drum roll for blend A. This is a classic. This is a classic blend of a mocha java. So you have here 66% of Ethiopia washed and a 33% Sumatra. And I will note once again that when creating these scores, as we listed on that initial page, that the coffee that has the greater proportion is also going to have a proportionally greater influence on these scores. And so what you're seeing here is that Ethiopia washed is really taking over these cupping scores, because when we showed that Ethiopia washed, as you see in the bottom, it's got that volume turned all the way down, and you're seeing that happen in the blend as well, and also in the blend flavor notes, where your original coffee was kind of bright, lemony, berry, herbal, earthy, kind of bringing in some of that Sumatra and some of that those good Ethiopian notes. It just dropped down, where you're just getting some of that citrus. That lemon turns into a citrus. It tastes a little bit roasty, maybe that Sumatra being a little bit darker, and now that Ethiopia is kind of just turned down, still at earthy, spicy, maybe a little flat. It's not the same coffee as it originally was. Do you have any notes on this one, Joe?
I think that was great.
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. So then moving on to the second blend, the blend B. This one was kind of, the idea was it's a classic drip. It's something that maybe a lot of folks will combine to just create that drip coffee that's stable over time. Both Colombia and Brazil, pretty stable flavor profiles where you can find those coffees. And we have 66% Colombia in this blend and 33% Brazil. The 66% Colombia really shines through. That's kind of what gives this one away, because that one was getting a little bit brighter and a little bit sweeter. And whereas that Brazil was kind of going the opposite way, where it was getting a little less body, a little less acidity. So the scores not changed too much here, because if you remember, for the Brazil coffee and the Colombia coffee, those new roast curves weren't drastically different either. So you're not seeing a whole lot of a difference in the blend itself. Joe?
Yeah, I would say we were dealing with those fractions of a point of variance, and so as we rounded those to a single digit, most of them just stayed very, very similar, with that it's definitely being what punched up. And so you're not changing it to roasted nut, which is a little bit more sweet. You get a little roasty note because things were a little bit more roasted a little bit more quickly, and those things can kind of add more texture, but not enough to really change the body. It just kind of helps change the perceived sweetness.
Yep. Awesome. Yeah, and so as Joe said, like those fractions of points really play a role here, because if that Brazil was the predominant coffee, the 66% in this blend, you would have seen, for example, the body score would have been it would have been a -1, because that would have had a greater influence on the blend itself. But in this example, the Colombia is the predominant coffee at 66%, and with a body of unchanged. That is why the blend itself is unchanged, though there will be just very minute differences. So yeah, awesome. Blend C. Fun coffee blend. This one is that fruity drip coffee, where you kind of have that Colombia as the backbone, but then you toss in a natural with that Colombia. So this one's going to be pretty bright, pretty sweet, with a little bit like chocolate cacao-y. But if you remember, that Ethiopia kind of had that lower temperature, lower heat, shrunk a little bit. It turned a little more acidic, a little sweeter, and a little lighter. And same with the Colombian, was kind of shrunk down as well. And that is why you're seeing like those brighter notes come through, a little more of that like undeveloped sugars, a little more nutty. And then you're seeing that kind of funky breadiness of that grade 2 Ethiopian natural kind of pop up there at the end on this blend. And this one, when going through the scores, a lot of folks had kind of flip-flop this one. This was a tough one, and really it comes down to those fractions of points again. Whereas if that Ethiopia natural was the predominant coffee in this blend, that reduction in body and that higher acidity would have shown through on the cupping form here. But since the Colombia was the predominant coffee, which was a little more unchanged in the cupping scores, that is why you're seeing a little more of an unchanged scores for the blend. Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I just got a question in the text box.
Definitely.
Asking why with 66% of the Colombia, there's no impact on color. We do have the color dropping in darkness. And if you look at the Colombia curve, the Colombia curve off of the baseline was dropped at a lighter and earlier time and tint. So if you look at that, that would be lighter already, and the same thing would be true for the Ethiopia. And so your color is going to drop in that. And so also those roastier notes are going to kind of drop a little bit more. So you're going to get more of that funkiness. And if you think about the funky nature of like a sourdough bread, maybe that soury kind of weird, funky thing that comes from fermentation is kind of what you get from those more lightly roasted naturals.
Yeah, that's spot on. Yeah, so the combination of those two coffees, which are both going to be a little bit lighter in color, is why you're seeing that reduction here as well. And just clarifying, a negative in color is a lighter coffee, whereas the 1, 2, 3 are darker. Which you can find if you're still a bit confused on those. We describe this cupping form on the webpage towards the bottom, which you're welcome to check out. So yeah, so this was blend C, that fruity drip coffee. And then moving on to blend D. Blend D and blend E are pretty challenging because there's 3 components now. So you're working with a lot here. And and so this makes it pretty tough to figure out. But if you kind of work through those flavor notes and then kind of work through what happened on the cupping score, you have a better idea of what these coffees can be. And so with blend D, this is kind of the workhorse blend, kind of similar to that Brazil Colombia blend, but now we add the Sumatra. So once again, it's that classic coffee profile where you're adding a little bit of that sweetness, a little bit of acidity from that Colombia, and a little bit of that earthiness and body from that Sumatra coming together to create this like citrusy, chocolatey, caramely, nutty, earthy, spicy coffee. And the way to figure out this coffee, once again, is you have to be looking at or thinking about the curves and then how that creates the curve of the predominant coffee, which in this case was the Brazil, having the biggest impact on the scores up there. So you're going to see a lower reduction in acidity because that Brazil had a bit less acidity. And that's going to kind of overpower the change in the addition in the acidity for the Colombian, but the Sumatra also had a bit less acidity as well because it was roasted darker. And then sweetness, you had more sweetness in the Brazil, you had more sweetness in the Colombia, and just a little less sweetness in the Sumatra. So that's why you're still seeing an increase in sweetness. And you're seeing a little bit of a darker color because of that Sumatra and the Brazil here. Both of those were roasted to a higher temperature, and so you're gonna be a little bit darker, even if that Colombia was that kind of hair lighter. Yeah, so, Joe?
Yep, I agree.
Awesome. Awesome. Solid. And then the final blend, the blend E. The blend E was kind of the second take on the Mocha Java blend, except now we're also including that natural. So we're breaking down, instead of 66% Ethiopia wash and 33% Sumatra, we kind of split that up and create 50% Ethiopia wash, 25% Ethiopia natural, 25% Sumatra. And once again, you're seeing just reductions in this coffee, in the scores here, because that predominant coffee is that Ethiopia washed, which had that baked influence at the end, or was baked, and all of that is just getting turned down the volume. And when that's the predominant coffee in this blend, you're gonna see that you're gonna have an influence. And so a lot of those bright fruity floral notes really transform into much more kind of those like flatter, bready, toasty, like very little of that citrus is coming through. That lemon is turning into just like a slight citrus. And then you're getting some of that funkiness from that Ethiopia natural and the earthiness from the Sumatra, and a little bit of roast as well from that darker Sumatra. Because those two Ethiopians are lighter coffees, that darker Sumatra you're gonna notice it's gonna shine through a little bit more. So, Joe?
Sorry about that. I had to mute myself there for a moment.
Oh, you're all right.
I totally agree with that. We're also seeing somebody saying that they only got one correct. Some people are saying that some were super challenging.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for. We're not here to get it right. We're here to learn and grow and kind of talk amongst ourselves and refine the theories that we all have in how these coffees roast. And our collective knowledge is hopefully more powerful than our individual knowledge.
Yeah.
So don't feel bad if you're
not at all.
Yeah, if you got some of these wrong. And even within the three of us, some of these things were debated and discussed and talked at length. And so these are our best theories put on paper. And if we were to practice this in real life with you all in the same room on a roaster with the real coffee, we may consider different. So you who got 1 out of 5 right, maybe you got more in real life.
Totally. No, that's spot on, Joe. The goal here is to learn, honestly. It's fun to have this competition, and we love that, but we want to be able to just kind of talk through these theories to give you a baseline to work from when you're at the roaster and you're looking at the roast curves yourself. It's all good. But now that we've worked through all 5 blends, Joe, this is the question that I said we would ask. Taylor and I are curious, what are your thoughts on pre-roasting versus post-roasting, which is this hotly debated topic of like, oh, you should post-roast or you should pre-roast because this, that, and whatnot. Can you just shed a little bit of light on that topic?
For sure. Yeah, there are a lot of different reasons why post-roast pre-roast blending should and should not happen. I think that there is a right answer or a wrong answer. If you think about it, technically every coffee that you roast is a blend. Everything is there are all different densities going into that. There are all different moisture contents going into that. And so from a microscopic look, we're always roasting blends. From a macroscopic look, blending pre-roast is helpful for a lot of reasons. Number one, your roast day, all you have to do is weigh out your coffee and put it into the roaster, roast it, and you're done. Whereas a post-roast, you have to weigh out multiple coffees, roast those all differently, and then blend those in different proportions, figure out what to do with remnants, figure out what to do whenever you have, like say you need 10% of an Ethiopia in something and your roaster is too big, so you have to roast more than that. You know, there are a lot of logistical challenges that come into post-roast blending. Along with that, I think that pre-roast blending in general is better for a consistent product, roast after roast. Because if you think about roasting 3 roasts in order to get 1 coffee, your chance of that having a variation off of your norm is higher. If you think about that over time, you're 3 times more likely to have a variability in it than you are with a pre-roast blend. As well as that, in particular for espresso, if you have one coffee that is a little bit more brittle, another coffee that is a little bit less brittle, and another coffee that is very low in its brittleness, as those go through your burrs on an espresso grinder, you're going to have variability in how each of those individual coffees grinds, and your grind particle size distribution is going to be kind of all over the map. And so for those companies that do a lot of post-roast blending, I generally find that the baristas are a little bit more frustrated with the coffee, and they're constantly making adjustments to the grind. Whereas those companies that rely on pre-roast blending, since the coffee is roasted at the same curve, your coffee has about the same brittleness, and so you get a much more consistent grind on pre-roast. Now, the argument for post-roast blending, generally that I hear the most, is that with a post-roast blend, you can really bring out the best in an individual coffee and have that individual flavor characteristic go into your blend so that everything is matching in such a fantastic way, because you've dialed up your Ethiopia natural, you've dialed down your Brazil natural, all of these different things you have more control over. And the theory against pre-roast blending is that how do you not over-roast one coffee and under-roast the other coffee in the same blend? Well, let me kind of look at both of those super fast. I know we're kind of tight on time.
Oh, yeah. No, you're good.
The reality of how heat exchanges in a mass is that your lower density object, or your lower density mass, or your smaller mass will absorb heat at the same pace that it gives heat off. Maybe it's a little faster with a lower density coffee or a smaller bean, let's say. Whereas your larger bean or higher density coffee will absorb heat at its own rate and give off heat at the exact same rate. Science is that you give off and gain heat at the same rate. If you put those in mass, those things equalize each other. So analogy for this is, if you think about, and a friend of mine invented this analogy, a mass of penguins on Antarctica. Within that mass of penguins, they're going to be very hot in a cold environment. They're generating a lot of heat. And within that mass, you also are going to have a bunch of penguin eggs, and you're going to have a bunch of penguin babies. The eggs are not going to cook, right? They're going to reach the same temperature as the overall group of penguins. So if you have a pea berry mixed in with a bunch of Pacamara beans, the pea berries are not going to over roast unless you're going at a very, very fast-paced roast. In most of our machines, if we're dealing with normal specialty coffees and in normal drum roasting application, our coffees are actually going to equalize themselves. Now, the faster you go, the more variance you're going to see. The slower you go, the more normalization you're going to see, or homogenization you're going to see. So there is some art and skill to that. But a pre-roast blend, you can bring out the best in each individual characteristic. And the point of the blend is to have a cohesive flavor profile that represents that particular blend as its individual self.
Yep.
And I think that you can do that best with pre-roast blend. Now, that's not to say that a post-roast blend is bad. I think the best application for a post-roast blend is if you want to have flavors of lighter roasted coffee and darker roasted coffee put together. If you want to have more chocolate and more acidity, then there's no other way to do that other than doing a post-roast blend. My argument, though, with that is if you want to bring out the best in a post-roast blend, the best way to do that is actually blending brewed coffees together. That nerdy to where you're going to take up that much extra roasting time, that much space, all of those different things. Go the full 9 yards and say that you're going to blend your brewed coffees, because then you can brew them to their best profile and roast them to their best profile, and then put those flavors together.
That's next level. I hope I find myself in a cafe here, and I hope I find myself in a cafe here soon as things continue to open up. But that would be interesting to see.
Post brewed blend.
Post brewed mixed blend. Write it down, everyone. That's a wonderful answer, and I think sheds a lot of light on at least the science and the theory behind why you might do either of them, which is fantastic. But some of you still might hold your own opinions, and that's great. Whatever works for you and your customers enjoy it, or it works for you. Awesome. That's great.
Yeah, the most important rule is just to do what tastes good.
Yeah. Yep. So, yep. And so there's a couple more questions, but I do want to just continue on here for folks who are looking to find the top 10 and maybe have to get going. And then if Joe, you have time, we'll see. We can maybe do a couple more question and answers after. But before we hop into the top 10, this is kind of just the recap of round 3, the scores. So you'll notice this round was a lot harder, and nobody actually had gotten all 5 correct. And you'll see we have half points here. And what we had talked about on that original page was a half point was given if you got all of the components correct in a blend, regardless of the proportions. Just like all those coffees you listed were in the blend. You got half a point for that. And then you got the other half point if you got the proportions correct. So that's why you're seeing those half points here. And so once again, you're kind of seeing people centered around that like 2.5, 2 point here, which is totally fine because these were hard. These were not easy. So with these scores and with the first 2 rounds, we did calculate the top 10 finishers, which is extremely exciting. And I don't know, I think maybe Taylor, if you want to jump in and kind of help
definitely
these top 10 finishers, would be awesome. And so just once again, thank you to everyone who competed. And even if you did not come in the top 10, as Joe had said, these were all theoretical based on the roast experts that we asked to help kind of judge these curves and help create these cupping form scores. This was just based on like our knowledge and how we think about things. And so maybe when we get into a roastery, or if we did this competition in person, it would look a little bit different. So don't be discouraged. Just keep learning, keep testing, keep trying, and just keep drinking coffee. So
and one more thing before we go, just a big shout out as well to, again, Ann Cooper, Shelby Williamson, Rob Hoos, and of course Joe. All of them were integral in making this happen. And during the process of creating the curves and the cupping forms and all the results that you just saw, all of them played a huge role in that. So again, you can see Ann and Shelby in that first webinar we did, and the second one, Rob, and of course with Joe. All of these are going to be available on Cropster's website as well. Just go to cropster.com. You'll see an area for videos, and you'll be able to rewatch all of these as well. So
and the first 2 are already up there actually if you want to go to them. So just check those out, and we'll have this 3rd video up once sometime soon. So Yeah, so little drum roll. We'll get started. Taylor, I'll let you kind of announce them.
Yeah,
As
sounds
we
good
go.
to me. So
So
one more thing before we jump into
we're really dragging this one out.
one more thing. So you may have noticed on round 3 that there was a question at the very end that was called
Yep.
tiebreaker.
Yep.
And the reason we did this is because we knew that there was a chance that people could receive the same score. And that is, as you'll see, as we go through these top 10 finishers, there were a few that did have the same score. And so what we had decided was, as you saw in the question, we wanted to ask a question that could be something that you input yourself so that there couldn't be any way that you could, of course, tie. And so what we decided was time and temperature of first crack of that particular roast.
Yep.
And then we know. Yep.
I was gonna say, just additionally, as we stated actually on the original page, that tiebreaker, we didn't really want to have to use that because there is a little bit of guesswork. Like it does require knowledge to get that correct, but there is a bit of guesswork. We did want to rely more on the actual answers for the rounds. And so first and foremost, the tiebreaker is actually, before that tiebreaker question is used, it's if people have the same score, the round 3 score is the most important, and then round 2. And then round 1. And then if it's still the same, then we go to the tiebreaker question. So yeah, just trying to
in
keep
this
it as
case,
fair.
also what we did was we prioritized, in this case, the time over temperature. So first we looked at the time at which first crack happened that you entered in, and then temperature after that.
And then temperature.
So if you're curious as to why someone may be higher on the list because they have the same score, then that is why. In this case. But,
exactly.
So for our 10th finisher, we have Jeff Yerxa, with 11.5 out of
Jeff.
Yes. Yeah. Shout out to Jeff. All right. So number 9, drum roll, please. We have Alexandra McLean. Congratulations. Number 9. Moving on to number 8, we have Alex Taylor. Love it. If there was a crowd, everybody would be cheering.
Everybody would be, they would be clapping right now, big time.
Going to number 7, we have Andrew Rabowich coming into 7th place. In 6th place, we have Ian Goodman. All right. And in 5th place, we have Kaz Orzel coming from the UK. All right. 4th place, we have Courtney Kang coming from Singapore. Congratulations. All right. So the top 3 for the inaugural Roast ID competition. Number 3, we have Isha Yang. Congratulations. 3rd place.
With an impressive score of 14.
Yes. 14 out of the 15.
That
very,
is
very good.
Very impressive.
Going to number 2, 2nd place. We have David Pittman. Congratulations, David.
Congratulations, David.
Yes, coming from the USA. And our first place winner for the Roast ID competition. Congratulations to Pat Connolly, coming from Australia. Good job. 14.5 out of 15. Fantastic.
That's incredible.
That's incredible. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody who completed the survey. If you were in the top 10, we will be reaching out to you to kind of coordinate your prizes. So look out for an email from either Taylor or myself or both of us. We will reach out and give you a little virtual high five and chat about how we can get you those prizes. So that's it really, folks. Really, once again, appreciate everybody joining us throughout these past 3 rounds, little over 2 weeks, so 15 days. It's been a lot of fun. We've been absolutely just floored by how many of you have competed and came out to watch these or joined in on these webinars. It's been incredible, and we're really grateful for everybody who has competed and participated, and we hope you gain something from this, maybe a little bit of knowledge from one of the webinars or all of them. We are excited about this, and hopefully we can continue in the future. We'd like to. Yeah, Taylor.
Yeah. So, and I just sent it in the chat too. Something we didn't include was the answer to the tiebreaker for that first crack. If you're curious, just shoot me an email at taylor@cropster.com. and we can give you that temp and time. I don't think we have it on hand right now, but yeah, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, feel free to reach out.
Yeah.
I have it on a different screen, so.
Cool.
But yeah. That's all I got.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joe.
Really,
thank you so much for all the positive feedback that we got.
Thank you all.
Throughout this whole thing. And yeah. All right. Talk to you guys later.
Thank you
See you
so
next
much, everybody.
time.
Have a wonderful day. And thank you, Joe, again.
Bye, guys.